one thing that I wanted to mention that in my understanding is perhaps common to Brazil and Hungary and India is that opposition to the regime, to its ideology, to its agenda, becomes a betrayal of the nation. And so, when you criticize the regime, its actions, its policies, you basically become a traitor in India to the Indian nation, such that there becomes this really troubling um, equation of an opposition to a political party and its agenda, and basically sedition. And in India, for instance, as part of this crackdown on free speech and social media and the press, there are hundreds of journalists. I mean, India was termed one of the dangerous places, one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a journalist because of the killings of journalists, including in broad daylight, the gunning down of a really prominent vernacular journalist, Gauri Lankesh. But you see that the nature of the charges that are often slapped against intellectual civil society organizations are sedition charges. And so to me, I mean, of course, this kind of both speaks to how seriously the regime opposes any dissent, but this equation of dissenting with a party and being a traitor to your country is, I think, what is the really to me deeply troubling aspect of the kind of nationalism that we see ascendant in India and across these countries. Because the irony in all this is that Indian nationalism was forged in the fierceness of nonviolent protest against the British. And so it's a nationalism that was premised on secularism, on inclusiveness, on an equal place for religious minorities. It was also a nationalism that was based in resistance. And yet the nationalism that is ascendant today is kind of abrogates both of these. It's both against dissent and it really comes down against minorities. And I thought that Oscar's point about these insider enemies was a really interesting point. I mean, we can call them insider outsiders, and at some point in time, they do become insider enemies. And so, again, this goes to the point that for Hindu nationalism, there's an external enemy, and that's Pakistan, which really represents, in some ways, and there's an equation again of Indian Muslims who are Indian. They are born and brought up in India, but there becomes an equation of the insider minority and the outsider enemy. And so I would say that in some ways India has some similarities. So, I don't think there's quite the concern of the military intervening in the way that it has in neighboring Pakistan to overthrow democracy. But what we see is a little bit more nuanced. It's the use of a military threat. And so now, it's well known that the regime kind of used this entire instance. So Pakistan is the bogeyman, so the kind of threat from a neighboring Islamic country and the equation of that to then a kind of, fifth column within the nation itself represented by the Muslims is the kind, so, it's a nationalism that kind of preys on this kind of military threat while still the military is in its barracks. So I think that is an interesting, in a way, nuance, not quite the kind of violence that we have seen, for instance, in the US, but on the other hand, the scapegoating of Muslims has taken on highly violent, hostile dimensions. And so, the idea of lynchings, again, bringing it to the US, but we've seen the lynchings of Muslim men. I mean, and this is not just Muslims. India has a long history of discrimination and hostility to lower castes. And I think a very India-specific question, Joel, getting to your opening remarks about the fact that we want to kind of have this comparative, but really get into the textured history of particular cases. So what is the role of Dalits, the former untouchables, in Hindu nationalism? I think becomes an important, and women, the highly gendered nation. So, there it's interesting because there was an opinion piece recently by someone I respect who spoke about how Modi tries to come across as a lot softer than, and the explicit comparison was Bolsonaro and Orban. And so, in some ways, there is this kind of, there's a similarity across them, but it's also a highly gendered idea of the nation. It's a highly high caste idea of a Hindu nation. So within religious nationalism, there are all these other gender and ethnic identities that play into it.